In August 2013, Wired magazine covered the end of the Kombi, with a tone that sat somewhere between obituary and disbelief. For much of the international press, it was the overdue farewell to an icon that had, in practice, already vanished from most of the world decades before. Germany had closed the line in 1979, Mexico in 1994, Brazil kept building. What foreign journalists couldn't explain was the mechanism behind that survival. Why had a single country kept alive for 56 consecutive years a design conceived in the 1950s? Why had a factory in the interior of São Paulo produced more than 1.5 million units of a vehicle the rest of the world already treated as a relic? The answer has less to do with the Kombi than with Brazil. Some cars are important, some cars are popular, and some cars become so present they start to feel natural. The Volkswagen Kombi in Brazil was exactly that, but when you look more closely, you realize that familiarity was hiding something far more rare, a historical anomaly. According to Volkswagen do Brasil itself, domestic production of the Kombi began on September 2, 1957, in the state of São Paulo, with 50% local components. It launched the brand's entire industrial operation in the country, and it would run for 56 years, surpassing 1.5 million units produced. That alone is remarkable. But the full weight of this story only appears when Brazil is placed next to the rest of the world. The T2 line was discontinued in Germany in 1979. In other words, the country that gave birth to the Volkswagen Bus moved on. Brazil did not, and that is exactly where the central question of this episode begins. How did a van from another era survive for so long? In a single country, long after it had stopped making sense almost everywhere else. To understand this, it helps to know what the Kombi meant outside Brazil. For much of the world, the image of the Volkswagen Bus carries a very specific weight. It evokes the counterculture of the 1960s, California highways, the hippie spirit, freedom, beaches, nostalgia. That is the global mythology of the vehicle. But in Brazil, the Kombi accumulated affection and memory while doing something else entirely. Before it was a cultural icon, it was a work tool. Its survival had less to do with romanticism and far more to do with utility, not a lifestyle icon, a working van. And perhaps that is exactly why this story needs to open with a sense of strangeness, not nostalgia. Because the Kombi was born in Germany, became a global symbol, crossed generations, lost ground in wealthier and more regulated markets, and yet remained in production in Brazil until 2013. A real vehicle, present, functional, almost too ordinary for most people to notice just how extraordinary its longevity actually was. This vehicle survived in Brazil for so long because, for decades, it kept solving real problems. Instead of asking why Brazil held on to an outdated vehicle, maybe the right question is a different one. Why did an outdated vehicle keep making so much sense there? Cost mattered. Simplicity had value. The Kombi was familiar, easy to repair, cheap to maintain, and above all, versatile. In 1984, Volkswagen itself made that clear without any hesitation, running a campaign that presented the Kombi as one of the most economical ways to carry a full ton of cargo. It was a tool, and in Brazil, reliable tools tend to survive for a very long time. It was also shaped for passengers, for urban services, for the small daily routines of collective mobility. The Lotação version, introduced in the early 1980s, added doors on the right side to make boarding and exiting from the sidewalk easier, a solution designed around the logic of Brazilian streets. The same Kombi as always, constantly adjusted to stay useful in a country where practicality spoke louder than refinement. That effort to keep it functional continued until the very end. In 2005, according to Volkswagen do Brasil, the Kombi swapped its old air-cooled engine for a 1.4 total flex water-cooled unit. By the 2011 catalog, it was listed at 78 horsepower on gasoline and 80 on ethanol. The project was aging, but it was still being technically stretched to remain sellable. For decades, Brazil had created the conditions for the Kombi to survive, a market that valued simplicity, an infrastructure that forgave technical limitations. But those conditions were not permanent. In 2009, CONTRAN, Brazil's federal body responsible for national traffic regulation, formalized the requirement for front airbags in all new vehicles. The regulatory timeline established that, from 2014 onward, every vehicle produced in the country would need dual airbags and ABS brakes. It was part of a broader shift. Brazil finally aligning its safety standards with what the rest of the world had been requiring for years. For most manufacturers, the adaptation was expensive, but possible. For the Kombi, it was impossible. Volkswagen do Brazil confirmed the end on August 14, 2013. The explanation was straightforward. The design could not accommodate dual airbags or ABS in any technically viable way. A structure conceived in the 1950s simply had no room for what the 21st century had come to require. The last Kombi left the production line in December of that year. To mark the occasion, Volkswagen launched the last edition, 600 units produced in limited series, celebrating 56 years of the model in Brazil. It was a symbolic gesture. The Kombi didn't need a grand funeral. It had already done enough. What the last edition represents is not nostalgia. It's the recognition that some stories have an honest ending. The Kombi didn't disappear because Brazil stopped loving it, or because it suddenly became useless overnight. It disappeared because the country itself began demanding something it could no longer deliver. For decades, it had served Brazil within the conditions Brazil provided. When those conditions changed, the bill came due. This is the complete arc. A vehicle that was born as a tool, maintained as a tool, and retired when the tool no longer served its purpose. What remains is not nostalgia. It's a precise portrait of how a country operates when utility speaks louder than innovation. If this kind of story resonates with you, subscribe to the channel. Every episode starts with a car and ends up somewhere larger. And this logic wasn't unique to the Kombi. In the next video, the Fiat Uno travels a similar road, and in some ways, an even more radical one. A car that arrived in Brazil as the promise of accessible modernity and ended up revealing, in its own way, the same tensions between what the market demands and what a country can actually sustain.